Henrietta, would you guys all mind to sit down? Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dennis Schäfer. I'm a member of the Goya Club, and it is a great personal pleasure to introduce my dear friend Luis Fernando Bañuelos Carrillo to all of you. He is a PhD candidate at the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at New York University here in the city, and currently works on a dissertation on the history of Mexican publishing from the 1920s to the 1970s, and is particularly interested in literary culture, the sociology of literature, book history, and the history of publishing. And today, he will talk about one of the strangest stores in the world. And I have to tell you that I think about 2 years ago, Luis had told me about the Crystal Bookstore for the first time. And I immediately said, this has to become a lecture at the Goya Club. So I'm very happy that I'm standing here right now introducing him, because Luis, as you'll learn over the course of the next 20 to 30, 40 minutes, actually I don't know how long you're going to talk. So we'll find out, yeah. So it's open, and this open-ended talk that we're about to experience is that you can just meet Luis for a coffee or a drink, and then he'll just come with an interlibrary loan from the University of Pittsburgh, and that'll just be, and he can just talk about this book that's somewhere in a stack, somewhere at Pittsburgh or Kansas State or wherever, and he'll just be one of the most important books in the history of Mexican publishing that he'll just introduce you to. You guys are nodding, he's done that trick on you guys before, yeah. And so please allow me to welcome Luis Bañuelos Carrillo this evening here at the Goya Club to give what will be a wonderful lecture. Take it away.
Thank you, Dennis. I wish I was as eloquent. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Eve, of course, for giving me the opportunity. To Dennis, because, yeah, this was in some way all of his idea. He's like the mastermind behind this whole thing. And I hope to be as compelling as he has made me out to be. So to begin, I will ask you to picture that it is July 7, 1946, right here in New York. You just went out to get the evening paper. You're flipping through it, you know, Europe is in shambles. The price of meat has just been decontrolled, stuff like that. People say that there's butter and cheese again on the Lower East Side. And after looking at those things, you go back to the book reviews, because of course it's Sunday, and what you find is these two reports from these two different libraries, bookstores, sorry. One in Paris, the other one in Mexico City. The first one is written by John L. Brown, a renowned critic of world literature. And what he describes there is a literary culture that is still recovering from World War II, of course, that is still populated by people like Gertrude Stein and Sylvia Beach. However, you get the sense that he knows, and everyone knows, that things will not be the same, that the party, so to speak, is over. And he's starting to hear about these terms like engaged literature, committed literature, these new demands on writing, on book publishing, etc. Right? So it's very much a report on a culture in transformation, in which it is not certain what will remain and what will become, what will be new. Now, you go to Mexico City. What do you see there? Let's take a look at how Milton Brackner opens. He writes, "In the glare of lavender neon, advertising an author, not a movie star, Indians verging on illiteracy wait for buses these mild evenings outside one of the strangest stores in the world, the Librería de Cristal, or glass bookshop, in the heart of Mexico City. Often, the mother nurses a baby under a dark shawl as her husband peers dumbly at row upon row of vivid bindings in the 40 curved and glistening windows, etc., etc., etc." This goes on for about a long page. Brackner names the names that he reads on the bindings of the books. He sees John Dos Passos, Oscar Wilde, Singer Lewis, John Steinbeck, all available in mass market and bound editions. He hears that The Human Comedy by Balzac, the whole set, is a recurrent bestseller. He even sees a copy of Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which was just published 3 years earlier and was turned into a movie the year before. And they say that it's selling quite well. Now, of course, we can see the combination of bewilderment and strong racial condescension with which Brackner describes the people that he sees surrounding the bookstore. It's not only that he finds difficult to believe that these writers will find their audience in front of these, so to speak, as he says, illiterate Indians. It's also that he sees the apparatus of advertising that is usually used for movies, for mass culture, for audiovisual culture, applied to books. He even asks, imagine, if you can, being in Times Square and seeing an ad for someone's complete poems, right? So Milton Brackner is not only implying that whoever came up with this idea is getting Mexico wrong, they're also getting like book selling wrong and modernity wrong, etc., right? Taking a step back, we can say that Milton Brackner is sort of ventriloquizing a way of looking at Mexico, and Mexico City in particular, that the cultural historian Mauricio Tenorio has called the search for the brown Atlantis. It's this desire by European and Anglo-American writers, intellectuals, travelers, to see Mexico as a window onto a pre-industrial, pre-modern world, something that is not touched by the horrors of industrial society. And well, again, just coming out of World War II, one can see why they would be interested in this alternative. This brown Atlantis was built, again, in the imagination by Mexicans. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, for example, they were very influential with their pictures of Tehuanas, etc. But you also have reporters like John Kenneth Turner with Barbaros Mexico, or John Reed, who wrote also on the Mexican Revolution, and a whole variety of travel writers, fiction writers like Catherine Ann Porter, Malcolm Lowry, Graham Greene, much later, Jack Kerouac, on whom you can see a wonderful exhibition upstairs if you're interested. Now, we don't have to share in Brackner's, let's say, racial prejudices in order to agree that this was a kind of a strange place, right? So I would like us, for the next few minutes, to consider these next questions. What was this place, this glass bookshop? What were the economic, political, etc. conditions that allowed such a place to exist, specifically in this site? What commercial interest in intellectual projects sustained it, and how was it experienced by the Mexicans who patronized it and went about their daily lives around it? Okay, so. Is that? Oh, okay. Is that? Okay, let's hope it continues. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I am not going to give you a whole stroll through the long history of book cultures in Mexico, but I do think that it's unavoidable to mention that the beginnings of the history of publishing and bookmaking in Mexico passed through this very building, because back in 1971, almost exactly 55 years to the date, it was here that the oldest extant book in the history of the Americas was first presented to the public. It was what is now known as the Mayan Codex of Mexico, back then known as the Grolier Codex, of course. And it just tells us that whatever we can say right now about cultures and the history of books in Mexico, it's part of a very, very, very long tradition that is ever evolving. My research is I'm interested in the social functions and cultural meanings of books, and they have always been evolving depending on cultural, technological, and social transformations. Also, here in New York, we have the oldest book made with European methods. It's in the NYPL, and it was printed in 1543 in Mexico City as well. Is the Doctrina Breve by Juan de Zumárraga. Now, again, I'm not going to get into all that, but I do think it's important to mention the way that books and book cultures functioned in Mexico in the 19th century, because it is my argument that the Crystal Bookstore represented a radical shift in how books functioned, what they meant, what they did in Mexican society. And I think it's important to know what came exactly before that. So very briefly, the history of bookmaking and book distribution in Mexico throughout the 19th century is a history of chaos, of destruction, and of a lot of uncertainty, right? There is a wonderful article by the book historian Hugo Diego Blanco called "The Library Besieged," in which he describes this series of expulsions, wars, nationalizations, etc., through which from 1767 to 1867, the vast corpus of books that were accrued and made in Mexico throughout the colonial period were destroyed, they changed hands, they were lost in many ways, right? Maybe you know this, but in New Spain, the colonial version of Mexico, there was a brief golden age of bookmaking towards the end of the 18th century. And so once the War of Independence in 1810 started, that golden age stopped, and it never really recovered. By the time that bookmaking in Mexico became a consistent tradition again, the technologies, the meaning of books were completely different. And so when the New Republic started to build institutions, they had this problem of how to incorporate, how to maintain, how to decide what to do with this vast tradition of bookmaking, of knowledge, etc. And that was reflected in the history of institutions of, well, specifically, I'm going to give you the example of the history of convents in Mexico. The biggest libraries in Mexico in the 19th century were clerical libraries. And in 1857 to 1861, the liberal governments decided to nationalize the goods of the church, basically because they were being used to finance a war against them. And between 1857 to 1861, liberal governments not only seized these books, but also deliberately destroyed the buildings in which they were being held. Why? Because they knew that they were very likely to lose control of certain cities, certain spaces, and they didn't want the conservatives to come back and be able to rebuild, right? So between 1860, around 1862, the first librarian of the National Library, Jose Maria Benitez, did the first catalog, and he found that from the about 116,000 books that were supposedly nationalized, about 90,600 remained there by the time he made the catalog. And so those 20-something thousand books disappeared, as far as he knew. And even those 90,000, I would be slightly doubtful whether they were there. They're certainly not all there right now. There is this witness called Antonio García Cubas. He was a very important geographer, and he wrote in his old age of seeing how these books were transported, lost, destroyed in the process of nationalization. He even describes it as a nightmare. In 1867, you may know that the Second Mexican Empire was defeated by the Republic. And at that point, the head of the Imperial Library was a friar named Fisher, who, after seeing the emperor be shot, took 200 boxes filled with books, set off to London, and sold them there. This was the beginning of what some have called the Fisher syndrome, a syndrome that afflicts many Mexican libraries, which is that things disappear and they turn up in New York, London, Paris, Austria, wherever, right? And so, why is this important? Okay, one of the most interesting, I think, documents of this moment is this book made in 1862 by Manuel Ramirez Aparicio, a conservative politician and writer, who made a huge encyclopedic collection of every convent, every building, and every library, not every book, but every collection that was destroyed and taken over. And you can really see the beginning of, this is an interesting thing for me at least, a conservative sensibility in the sense of social conservatism was very much entwined with a culture of conservation, of cultural conservation and the material conservation of books. The first people to actually care about these sorts of things were the conservatives, the people who believed that the church should remain in power in Mexico because they believed that they were the only institution strong enough and wide enough to maintain the country together, which, you know, after the succession of rebellions and American interventions and French interventions, one can see why they would think that, right? And so, again, the liberal project for a Mexican state really struggled to incorporate this legacy. However, they did win. The liberals did win, and eventually in 1876, liberal dictatorship was established with Porfirio Diaz at the helm, and with him, what I would call political economy of raw materials out, manufacturing capital goods in was established. What does that mean? Most people in Mexico worked in the fields, in mines, etc. Their products would be exported, and they would be used to import manufactured goods, things from France, from the US, from Europe in general. And this applied to books as well. There were a lot of printing presses and bookstores in Mexico. However, most of them were not particularly advanced. They produced very expensive books, in part because there was not really a big public to whom to buy them. Yeah? And so for a long time, the main book distributors were people whose main job was to be middlemen between producers in Paris, in New York, etc., and the Mexican market. However, slowly, those same producers started to bring the first industrial presses. And so they started to, let's say, undermine their own business model. However, what I think is important to say is that this is a moment in which what we could call a consumer culture emerges in Mexico, in the sense that more and more people start living in cities and more people start to get what they need to live in a day-to-day basis from stores by buying it. Instead of food and clothing being something that you need to either get from someone that you know is going to make it, or make it yourself, make it inside the home, you are going to go and buy it at a place. And that transformation, that like very slight change of frame of mind in which stuff goes from stuff that you make or you get from their makers to something that you just go and get at a store, I think it's an important switch that takes its time to get to book cultures, because it was this sort of minoritarian business. By the end of this Belle Époque, what I'm calling it, you have actually two different tiers, let's say, in the book trade or in the print trade in general. On the one hand, you have what I call the circular book trade. You have books, such as many that we have here, which are considered valuable. They are rare. They were either imported or they were made in small runs of a couple hundred, maybe. And there are many testimonies of writers from the early 20th century, writing of how these books would be sold, and then you would find them again at the same stands, right? Books would not be things that would stay for very, very long at a given space. It would be assumed that book selling and book buying were part of the same business activity, right? which, again, I don't think many of us go to what we now call bookstores expecting to sell our books. Some do that, but not all of them. And so that's one. And if you see, there are these two very different scenes that I am showing you there. On the one on top is street vendors in this very famous market in Mexico City called the Market of El Volador. And on below, you have one of the many booksellers at the Seminary Street. And even though they look very similar, actually they were very connected because, again, writers from the period, Rubén Campos is a great chronicler of this moment. He wrote of how many of the best and most knowledgeable booksellers would be at the Plaza del Volador, not necessarily at the more established, more well-funded bookstores. Now, the other tier of print culture was a burgeoning ephemera culture, right? Broadsheets, newspapers, stuff like this, printed by a very famous editor named Antonio Vanegas Arroyo, who employed José Guadalupe Posadas, of whom you may know. He's one of the most characteristic, let's say, illustrators in Mexican graphic culture. And these were, again, ephemera. These were things that would be sold for a couple of cents. They would always have large illustrations because a lot of times the people who would buy them would not be able to read the text themselves, but they would know that it was maybe a crime story or that it was a humorous story. And they would buy them, and someone somewhere would be able to read them aloud, and these much more communal practices of reading would come about. However, if you notice what is missing here is what we now would call, well, books, bestsellers, new releases, etc. And this was a matter of great disappointment and great bitterness for a lot of writers in Mexico and all across Latin America. And it brings us to what I like calling the desire for the market, right? In the early 20th century, writers, intellectuals thought that the way for them to acquire, to be able to be in a modern literary culture was to create a market. José Martí, writing from right here from New York, wrote to Manuel Mercado of how he didn't think he would be able to live as a writer if he went back to Cuba or to wherever in Latin America, because there just wasn't a market for that kind of thing. And he thought that there was no reason for there to be. Why? Because there were not really a lot of people who just knew how to read. These mass literacy campaigns just hadn't happened yet. And, well, in Mexico City, 30 years later, Francisco Monterde, in the middle of a very famous discussion as to the possibility of a Mexican literature, he wrote of how writers, if they wanted to publish their own books, they had to do it themselves, or they had to pay the publishers. There wasn't really a business model in which a publisher gets a book and makes money by selling it to customers, rather than by providing the service of publishing to a writer. Now, what changes this? A revolution, of course, the only thing that can change a society that quickly. I'm not gonna stop too much in this, but 1910, Mexican Revolution, 1917, there's a new constitution that guarantees the right to a public education. And there's actually a very, very, very effective literacy campaign, such that by the 1930s, there is an effective mass readership in Mexico. It's concentrated in some cities, not always in the cities that you would expect, but yeah, there are there. And there are these two politicians, Vasconcelos and Daniel Cosío de Villegas, who they lead these industrial policies regarding the publishing industry. They are both considered intellectuals. They have writings, they have books and novels and fiction that you can study, but in reality, they are, I believe they are closer to someone like, I don't know, Keynes, because they take this model of let's take the state and modernize the production apparatus of publishing, because that's the only way that we will get to bridge this gap between literary culture and the masses, by making these books into cheap commodities that can be acquired by anyone. Now, the last step that I swear we're going to get to the Crystal Bookstore that get us there is the defeat of the Spanish Republic in the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. When in 1939, Franco and his nationalist troops take over Spain, a lot of the Republicans end up taking exile, again, here in New York. The Casa Hispanica by Colombia, I can attest to that. Many of them in Buenos Aires, many of them in Mexico City. And many of them are intellectuals, editors, and they bring with them their projects, their expertise, and in a lot of cases, their stock of the publishing that they had already done. One of them is someone that I have spoken a lot about to some of these people here, called Rafael Jiménez Siles. Jiménez Siles is a very contradictory personality because on the one hand, he was a communist and he was jailed for doing anti-monarchical propaganda. At the same time, he was part of a sort of monopolistic scheme to conglomerate the publishing business in Spain. It failed because his financial backers went bankrupt, but that can just tell you how heavily leveraged and how speculative his businesses were. At the same time, he also helped modernize the book industry in Spain in the 1930s by founding the first book fair. But also, once the war started, he became basically the head of this soft propaganda department of the Communist Party called the Distribuidora de Publicaciones. They wouldn't do like white propaganda, but they would publish books and distribute. Yeah, I'm going to call it soft propaganda for now. Now, 1939, the Republic falls. Many intellectuals left for Paris and then for elsewhere. And Jiménez Siles arrived in Mexico with a cable from the ambassador, one of the most radical Mexican politicians at the time, called Alberto Tejeda. And the cable is a recommendation to then President Lázaro Cárdenas, advising him to fund the projects that Jiménez Siles is bringing to Mexico. The way that Tejeda describes the project is as a project to establish a true wellspring of socialist ideology in Mexico, now that fascism and also, in their minds, liberalism is on the rise and winning in Europe, of course. And so the idea, as Tejeda sees it, is that Jiménez Siles will take his work from Distribuidora de Publicaciones, his company from the Communist Party, and reestablish it in Mexico and try to, win hearts and minds from there. So in order to do that, they found this new company called EDIAPSA, or Ibero-American Company for Book Publishing and Distribution, which was basically a state-owned company. The money was provided by Mexican banks, Mexican politicians, some of them incredibly corrupt, some of them very good writers, like Martín Guzmán. And they named Jiménez Siles as CEO of this company. However, the company is technically a private company. It just happens to have public funds behind it. They have publishing, distribution, and a small short-lived bookstore called Librería Juárez, which will close because they will build a new, bigger, more ambitious bookstore. I think that EDIAPSA is a very it is not known in the study as it should be because it is a strange project. It is on the one hand part of this Hispanist intellectual ambition that many Republican exiles have to rebuild Spain of the mind, let's say, through what Salomé Fenn calls their ideal libraries. Jiménez Siles wasn't the only exile who wanted to make his own publishing business. At the same time, it's a straight project of the Mexican revolutionary government, and it is also basically a conglomerate. It is a business that is marketing itself to booksellers and also to editors. It wants to edit, to publish, and to sell the books itself. Because again, our good friend Jiménez Siles had seen those conflicts up close over in Spain. Now, there is a very, very widely studied conflict, let's say, related to EDIAPSA, and it is the conflict related to this magazine called Romance. I'm going to go very, very briefly over it. This magazine was founded in 1940. It published around 25 numbers. It lasted about a year and a half. And from the beginning, it was incredibly contradictory in how it built itself and how the different people who were involved described it in their writings. Officially, it was supposed to be a platform for transatlantic dialogue, hence its name, Romance, languages that come from Rome. However, some writers like Antonio Sánchez Barbudo thought that it would be a revival of a radical magazine called Hora de España, which had been publishing actual hard communist propaganda during the Spanish Civil War. Jiménez Siles, however, always described it as basically the advertising bulletin for the companies in EDIAPSA. So all of these different ambitions for the magazine collapsed. By late 1940, Jiménez Siles had essentially purged every communist that was remaining from both EDIAPSA and Romance, which is a very communist thing to do, actually. Now, Jiménez Siles, in describing his decision, he said that it was a matter of professional commitment. After all, he was CEO of a company. He had a duty to shareholders to make the best business decisions, and the Mexican people had given him their money. He had to make it pay. That's the only way to have a successful business, etc. And many years later, he even went so far as accusing this communist apparatchik, Antonio Mije, of trying to convince him to deliberately make the business fail so that the Communist Party would get the remaining stock, let's say. However, Sánchez Barbudo, this more radical writer, after they were purged, he published an announcement in El Nacional, a national newspaper in Mexico, announcing that they would do a new magazine, entirely free from any business commitments, and that it would be a magazine free of all prejudices, whether ideological, national, commercial, or literary. These were his accusations against Romance, EDIAPSA, etc. They were corrupted by business, and they had become nationalists against this more wide Hispanist ambition. Many years later, in an introduction to a collection that actually Jiménez Siles was responding to, he said that probably they were looking for new investments and they needed someone less radical to be at the helm of this company. So why do I bring all of this? Because it shows us first that the publishing business, at least at this moment in this milieu, it wasn't clear that it was going to be a business. Like the money and the resources, the people behind it, they had political interests, they had ideological investments. It wasn't, again, completely obvious that the way that they would go would be the business way. However, that is the way that most of these politically inflected publishing ventures ended up being in Latin America. The state as editor and publisher has been one of the biggest players in the publishing industry in Latin America, and they have almost all of them followed these mixed private, public, profit-seeking, but politically inclined models. In Mexico, you have the very famous case of the Fondo Cultura Económica, which still exists to this day, and the National Graphic Workshops, which they're kind of like the state printing press. And these other much more ambitious projects in Venezuela, like Biblioteca Ayacucho, in Cuba, at the Cuban Institute of the Book, which still exists, and the Instituto del Libro in Brazil. Again, but almost all of these were the result of these sorts of engagements between the literary, the ideological, the political, and the business. Finally, I promise you. November 14, 1940, the official bulletin of the Mexican government announces that the regent of the federal district is authorized to lease 4 pergolas located to the east of the city's Alameda Central for up to 10 years. They shall be adapted for a cafe, a restaurant, a tea room, and a bookstore. Now, I don't know if you know what a pergola is, but they're sort of like arcades. They're these long, flowing, garden-ish structures. If you have been to Mexico City, you know that there is the huge Palace of Beaux Arts, el Palacio de Bellas Artes, which is next to the Alameda Central, which is actually the oldest existing public park in the Americas as well. And when the Palace de Beaux Arts was designed, this sinuous line of arches was meant to be the transition between the greenery of the Alameda and this huge marble palace that was supposed to house the National Theater. Now, this picture is from 1897. It was one of these projects by the Porfiria and the dictatorship, and they didn't finish it by the time that the revolution came. And so the revolutionaries had to take them over and see what to do with them. They decided to finish the front of the of the Palacio de Bellas Artes. It used to be much bigger in the design. And the arches were left like that with only the iron core for a while. And they were used for street vendors and sometimes painting exhibitions. By 1933, this is what they looked like. You can see behind the Alameda, you can see the Palacio de Bellas Artes and the pergolas there in the middle. This is the raw material, let's say, from which the Librería de Cristal, our topic of conversation, would be built. Now, very quickly, I wanted to mention that, again, this is a case of the revolutionary government taking over infrastructures left unfinished by the dictatorship. The most famous of the cases is the Monument to the Revolution, still standing in Mexico City, which was supposed to be the core of this monstrous semi-fascist legislative palace, which, again, wasn't finished by the time that the revolution came. Here it is. 1940, it opened for the first time. It was divided in 4 different departments. Again, if you've been to Mexico City, you may recognize that this is taken from the Latin American Tower, which for a while was the tallest tower in Latin America. At this point, this picture is taken from the highest floor from which that had been built by that point. It was like the 40th. And let's look at a few things. You can see that on top of the building, there are the different announcements with these neon lights that Milton Bruckner found so alluring. You can see that in front, what you see mostly is public buses. The people who would be living their lives around this bookstore were mostly working-class Mexicans who were moving around the city, going about their lives, etc. We can actually read most of the announcements that are on top. In the northernmost part, you can see an announcement for this magazine called Tiempo, owned by Guzman, this guy that took over the APSA that was a leftist but not red enough. That magazine has long been suspected of being a front for his personal interests rather than any kind of literary or intellectual pursuit. You have 2 different Mexican novels being advertised, Senderos de Pasión, Paths of Passion by Dina Rico, and The Hidden Woman by Miguel Lira. Both of them are lost to time. But we can see that they were sold for about 5 and 6 pesos, which was just over a day's wage with the minimum wage in Mexico City. There's also, I don't know, yes. You can see where the picture was taken by Milton Bruckner. This picture was taken about 2 years after Bruckner was there. And right next to it, there is an announcement for a manual for mechanography to learn how to type, right? And it was 5 pesos, so just above a day's wage. The day's wage was $4.50. So you can see here what kind of books and what kind of publications the bookstore assumed people would want to buy. Now let's go inside. The bookstore had 4 departments: general, popular, technical, and children's. Again, following the model of the department store. And if it is mentioned in histories of bookstores, etc., it's because it was the first bookstore to have an open concept, to not have a counter in front, but to let people come in and browse. And that completely changes the relationship that a person has to any commodity. It's not just I am going to go and speak to a person who will provide the object to me, but I am going to interact with them and see what my fantasies makes me buy, right? Books are not an object of sacred value, let's say. They are not just tools, but they can also be an object of desire for like regular people, let's say. And this picture is from this magazine that had effectively become the marketing apparatus of the business. This is the front of the popular department. And what I find interesting about this is that aside from saying that it's the popular department, you see a list of topics: technical books, science, novels, poetry, theater, art, philosophy, religion, right? You can still see here that intellectual or broadly pedagogical project that EDIAPSA was supposed to have, in the fact that popular books are also popular education books. I don't think this is that important, actually, but there is a weird breakaway bookstore that was in the northern part of the bookstore. This is what I'm researching right now. I don't know exactly what it is, but there's a lot we don't know still about how this bookstore worked. It was owned by the government. It was run by Jimenez Iles, but also there was an attempt to make a restaurant, which apparently never panned out. Maybe I will let you know someday, hopefully. Now, I just want to finish with this. In the 1960s, these broad educational policies had paid, and the Mexican people were more highly educated than they had ever been in Mexican history. There was this combination of hope and also fear of the young population that was flooding high schools and colleges, etc. And those were finally the constituencies that book publishers found for their products. I think it's very telling that in 1952, again, remember that this Librería de Cristal was part of a larger editorial project. When they were trying to publish popular books, what they published was this translation of an American book called The Great Symphonies, How to Identify Them and Memorize Them, by Sigmund Spaeth. He was a guy who had a radio program. It's a book that is supposed to appeal to, let's say, middle-class audience that wants to acquire a high culture education. By the 1960s, what they're trying to sell is this like adolescence novel. Jose Agustin is the main writer of what we would call the Mexican Beats. You know, the writers of the wave, they are called. But the cover is clearly meant to titillate, to allure a young audience. And I think that this a photograph by Bob Schalkwick, a very prolific photographer, sort of shows you this. You see way back behind the popular, again, side of the store, these very modern, at the time they were very modern, buses that were just being implemented in the city. And in the front, you see two young people, which I spent a lot of time looking at this picture. I'm pretty sure that that's like a woman in her early 30s and her like 14-year-old son. It just tells you how, I think it shows you how incredibly young everyone was in Mexico at this point. And these were the people who ended up patronizing the Cristal bookstore. If you know the Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño, he has a story called The Grove, which is actually set inside the bookstore. I am not going to show you any of that. I decided that I'm going to end this by showing you a clip from a movie. This movie is called A Strategy Wedding, let's say. It's clearly based, it's almost a ripoff of a Marilyn Monroe movie called How to Marry a Millionaire from the 1950s, I think. And in the 1950s movie, There's 5 or 6 models who rent an apartment in the Upper East Side, and they try to find bankers and rich men to marry. In this one, the protagonists are booksellers. They are actually the booksellers of the Librería de Cristal. So I'm just gonna show you a clip, and hopefully we can have a conversation. I am very curious what you think about it. Let's see. This is the first scene.
¿Tiene usted fenomenología filosófica de Hegel?
Un momento. Mónica, ¿tenemos fenomenología filosófica de Hegel?
Querrás decir fenomenología del espíritu.
Creo que sí, pero tiene la palabra filosófica.
No, entonces es propedéutica filosófica. Los dos son de Hegel, pero son 2 libros distintos. ¿Cuál desea?
No sé,
¿En qué año va usted?
en tercero.
Ah, entonces es el primero. Anaquel 28, segunda fila.
Por favor.
Señorita, quiero todos esos libros, de ahí a ahí y de aquí hasta aquí.
¿Qué clase de libros desea?
Todos esos, ya le dije, los bonitos.
Perdóneme, señora, pero los libros no se compran así.
Ay, ya lo sé, hija, pero es que los quiero para un librero muy lindo que tengo en mi nueva casa.
Ah, sí, es probable que sean muy decorativos.
No se extrañe, dicen que soy una nueva rica, y a decir verdad, sí lo soy. No tuve oportunidad de estudiar y mucho menos de comprar libros, pero ahora sí tengo para comprarlos los que me gusten. Y algún día los leeré. Yo sé que soy una burra y no me importa que lo sepan. Si viera qué bien me tratan en todas partes.
Pero ¿no le amarga la vida pensar eso?
Ya he aprendido a conocer a las gentes. Y créame, lo más importante en este mundo es el dinero.
Usted exagera.
A su edad se tienen muchas ilusiones. Si fuera usted rica, aunque fuera usted más fea, aunque fuera usted fea, le sobrarían pretendientes. Y sobre todo con dinero.
Yo estoy bien así.
Bueno, ya he hablado demasiado. Aquí tiene mi nombre y mi dirección. Envíeme los libros, los pagaré enseguida.
Está bien, señora, cómo no. Muchas gracias.
Gracias a usted. Y no se fije, tal vez esté un poco chiflada.
¡Qué guapa está!
Está divina. Muchachos, ¿cómo están? Estás hecha una reina.
¿Cómo te va, Virginia?
Muy bien, tenía tantas ganas de verlas.
Señorita, ¿tiene usted confidencias de una quinceañera?
Por aquí, por favor. Te espero. Todo está igual. Igual a cuando trabajaba yo aquí.
¿No lo extrañas?
A ustedes muchísimo. La librería imposible. Ya no hallaba yo la forma de salirme de aquí.
Recuerdo que te aburría mucho el trabajo.
Igual que a ti, solo que yo no tengo tu paciencia.
Y dime, ¿estás contenta? ¿Realmente contenta?
Sí, encantada. Ya no tengo el problema de pagar las rentas atrasadas, ni de los abonos de los vestidos, de los zapatos, ni tener que pedir prestado para completar el mes. Ricardo me adora, me llena de regalos. Tengo más de lo que necesito.
Virginia, recuerda que nos conocemos hace muchos años. Dime la verdad.
Bueno, claro que no se puede tener todo.
¿Qué pasa?
Ricardo siempre me quiere tener escondidas porque teme que su esposa se entere. Claro, eso me molesta.
¿Recuerdas que hablamos mucho sobre eso?
Sí, pero yo no quisiera volver a trabajar en esto. Mira, Mónica, sin dinero no se puede vivir.
Si esa manera de pensar te hace sentirte mejor.
Tenía las manos largas.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to stop talking here, but thank you so much for listening, and I hope we can have a brief conversation about these things.
Okay, we have a mic going around, and if somebody wants to start us off with a question, feel free. Otherwise, okay, Eve is already jumping in. Go away. Take it away, Eve.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Oh my gosh! And the shop girls memorialized in that movie. That was amazing. Two really quick questions. What caused them to die, and does anything of the buildings survive?
Excellent questions. So the store stood there from 1940 to 1976, and it was demolished when the subway station next to Bellas Artes was built. And there are still some like rocks from the foundations. Like when I went there, I found some, I took some pictures, but I don't think they were anything to write home about. I would have brought them here. There was a small like grassroots movement to protect it, but in the end, it was a business and it was on federal lands, so they could just remove them. Yeah, you can thank Luis Echeverria for the demise of this bookstore. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. It's so fascinating. One of the questions that I had was about the bookstore as a means of cross-cultural transmission. And so were there sort of events that the bookstore had that would bring in authors from outside of Mexico or within Mexico to bring their bring their work to a different audience?
So the bookstore was supposed to have a space like that, a space for events, a space for exhibitions. There are reports of, like news reports of planned exhibitions, but I have never found actual proof that they did happen. I think that they intended for them to have that function that now bookstores have, but I don't think they were particularly successful, let's say.
Obviously, only questions from this row here. So could you talk a little bit about the publishing industry at that time? And I only know such a little bit, but in '67, when 100 Years of Solitude was published, I think it was a paperback. It was 8,000 copies, and it sold immediately. Was this the kind of ferment? Was that a lot for that period of time? Were publishers making money?
Well, actually, the expert on that exact question is right here. It's Nora. I will try to answer. So the publishing industry in Latin America in general, let's say, had a long period of building up to the commercial successes that we now know as the as the Latin American boom. And so I think that the presses and the publishing houses that I discussed here were, let's say, the lead up to those big successes. But again, maybe Nora is the one who should answer this.
Just to add to that, 100 Years of Solitude was an exception, particularly at that time, and it created sort of like a wave situation for a lot of other writers within the Latin American boom, particularly because it was published in Argentina and then it moved through Latin America and Spain. That's sort of what happened. A lot of writers had a lot of books within Spain, but in Latin America it was harder to get that much print. Sorry.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a question myself. So you talk about the open concept of the bookstore, of the Crystal Bookstore sort of being its defining feature sort of at this point. But in the clip, that's not what happens. Somebody comes in and sort of says, oh, actually, I need Hegel's, that's it wrong. And then the idea is still that the bookseller is the expert, not only on the books in the store, but also on the needs of the customer. So I'm just like, if you could maybe unpack that open concept on the one hand, but yet the bookstore itself, the bookseller in this context, acting.
Thank you for that spontaneous question. So if we want to parse a little bit more the scene, you see the people enter the store, these three different customers, because this is like a fairy tale, and they all go straight for the bookseller, but they are walking amongst the books. There are tables with a lot of things there, and they could have technically entered and found their way inside. for narrative purposes, of course, they had to talk to the bookseller. But you do see that they can traverse the way of traverse the bookstore their own way and find whatever they want. Of course, the particularity of the character played by Basilia Pinal, who is, if you know Luis Buñuel, for example, she's a very prominent actress in his movies, is that she's the one who knows everything. She's the one that knows what they want, right? And as the movie progresses, and she tries, as in the original Marilyn Monroe movie, as she tries to find someone to marry, she will also be the one who knows what these buyers are looking to buy. Right, so the bookstore becomes a site for this knowledge of how commercial culture works to translate between commodity, commodity purchasing and, let's say, like what Gail Rubin would call the trafficking in women, etc. It's a good movie.
Throughout your history of Mexican publishing, which was great. Throughout your history of the Mexican publishing, which was great, you talked about conservatives and then how Jimenez Siles was also sort of against communists and whatnot. And I was wondering, is that like a trend that continues throughout Mexican publishing history? Like, does it have like a more conservative ideology, or what do you think?
I mean, I think that's the eternal bane of any publishing venture. You know, how do you, in any actually any cultural venture, how do you square the need to maintain a viable business and at the same time keep a certain allegiance to whatever ideals you may have that are not as profitable, be they artistic ideals or literary ideals or more political ideals. I think in the case of Mexico specifically, the fact that many of these writers and intellectuals like Daniel Cosío Villegas, José Vasconcelos, Rafael Jiménez Siles, they had the backing of this developmentalist state, this state that was very interested in putting money towards successful businesses, successful industries. And so if you had that kind of thing in mind, like I'm going to run a business and the business happens to be books, you could have a very successful career that way. That's why Mexico has some of the biggest publishing houses this side of the Atlantic at this moment, right? It's Mexico and Buenos Aires. The difference is that Buenos Aires had a much more developed reading culture, had a higher literacy rates, etc. In Mexico, it was very much the support of the state for these more, I'm not going to say conservative, but like business-oriented publishing ventures that allowed Jimenez Siles and other, again, quote, conservatives to succeed. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. Do we know or have any information on the financial viability of the bookstore? Was it successful, breaking even, something in between?
I do have this. It was not particularly successful in the 40s. However, towards the 1950s, it started to acquire other sites throughout Mexico City. And slowly it became not Librería de Cristal, but Librerías de Cristal. And actually the last of these closed, I think, in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the fun part was over.
To go back to publishers and bookstores, on the second floor in the exhibition on Kerouac, there is the letter from the reader of On the Road, the Knopf reader, going, seriously? We're not going to do this one. But I'm curious about could it be a cultural thing? Crystal, the word crystal is spelled with a Y and an I. Is this what is up with that?
Okay, so that's just me writing it in English. Yeah, with a Y? I mean, yeah, that's true. I do not know. I just saw that as
Yeah.
Okay, no, but the thing is that there's an answer to this. The biggest department store in Mexico, even to this day, is called the Iron Palace, Palacio de Hierro, right? And it was named after a building which was the first department store in Mexico, and it was named after the building because it represented modernity. You know, the material, the glass and steel industrial architecture was part of its draw. Now, in Spain, in Madrid specifically, there is maybe, the Crystal Palace, which is at Palacio al Parque del Retiro. And for a long time, it has been believed that the Crystal Bookstore was named after the Palacio de Cristal, the Crystal Palace in Spain, as a sort of way by Jimenez Siles to connect his new Mexican venture with something from his homeland. I have not really found any evidence to that effect. However, I think it's closer to the Palacio de Hierro, to the Iron Palace, in order to give it a sense of modernity, of industrial forward thinking. Being called Crystal Bookstore was probably aiming in that direction, let's say. Come again?
With the I and with Y.
It's good. There's trouble Googling it, is what she's saying.
Yeah.
Right, binging it. Yes, right. Speaking of the material culture of it, are there archives? Are there records from this? Do we know what their little sale? This is a really geeky book collecting club question. Do we know what their little bookseller labels looked like? Have you been finding artifacts that floated through this store over the years?
I have found the Constitution documents that they are in the archives of Martin Luis Guzman, one of these characters. However, this is something that I've discussed with several people. Generally, business history in Mexico is a very recent field. In the last 20-something years, there have been this is something from economic historians, etc. They often complain that specific firms have not been followed through. And this is one of those firms that have not really been studied in that way. I haven't found specific archives of the Crystal Bookstore, only of the people involved, the intellectuals. What I have found is the actual books that they published. They did produce a huge amount of both translations and Mexican writers, etc., that you can still find fairly easily in a lot of American universities, actually. That's what I think Dennis was referring to.
Actually, I have two sort of questions. Could you maybe go back to one of the pictures sort of from above when you sort of decoded this one. Did they every time they sort of had a new writer that they were advertising, they changed out the letters on top of the bookstore? Is that yeah.
They rotated monthly after analyzing sales figures, supposedly. But each month they changed, yes.
Okay, that's nuts.
And often they followed the movie adaptations. So right at that moment, Senderos de Pasión was, I think, a radio play, like this Path of Passions. And La Escondida, this other novel by Miguel Lira, had just been adapted into a film the year prior. So there was a very much cross-media appeal in order to get to those people who we see walking in front, whom I would have liked to ask a lot of questions.
Which is also why it was featured in the film, because that was just a landmark for Mexico City at the time. What is that? Is that a stretch? Or was it? Because this is the cross-cultural marketing that you just mentioned. Given that it's a setting of a film, it's the opening sort of. Does it make the film an advertisement for the Crystal Bookstore as well? Is it woven into that infrastructure? Is my question.
I mean, yes. The answer is yes. The thing is that the movie that I just showed you a few minutes from, I know it was a long clip, but I hope it was worth it. It's actually a long advertisement for the modern architecture of Mexico City in the 60s. They film inside of banks, and you see their lobbies, and you see the new parks and the new attractions that they had just built throughout the 40s and 50s. And the fact that they have the Crystal Bookstore right there in the middle is definitely a little wink to the fact that it had indeed become sort of something of an architectural landmark of, again, commercial modernity, etc., in Mexico City.
Two questions, very different. One is, why was it built in 3 different buildings, or was it 3 different buildings? And then second, did they have to file taxes or anything? Like
So it was built in 3 different buildings because that's just the structure of the pergolas of these arcades. That's how they were. They just came in and built on top of what they found. And as for taxes, I'm gonna guess, and I'm gonna guess no.
I'm just thinking about Porrua. It's also pretty old. I don't know if it was also like state sponsored, but it's still here. How is that possible compared to this one that, like you said, no taxes, they had the land like from the get-go? How could the Librerías de Cristal not continue, or how did it just end when the metro showed up?
So about Porrua, Porrua is a publishing house and also a bookstore that dates back to, I think, 1903 is when it opened. The owners were also Spaniards who came to Mexico. And they became very ubiquitous around the 60s, precisely around this time, for a collection, no, it was in the 50s, for a collection designed by Alfonso Reyes, a very famous Mexican intellectual, in which they published very, very, very canonical Western classics in very accessible copies. So what I would say probably is that Porrua survived because of that collection, Sepan Cuantos, and also because they were in possession of such a valuable piece of real estate, let's say. But yeah, I mean, Porrua is also a very interesting case study because in the beginning it was a bookstore, and these Spaniard brothers, they would import books from Madrid and sell them in Mexico City, and eventually they started to build up their own capacity to print, to edit, etc. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.